Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Mallard. I'm Enerdata's head of marketing. Welcome to this webinar. 30 years ago, some people decided to spin off of a research center and created Enerdata. And since we're celebrating this anniversary, we thought it was the right timing to take a look back at what happened in the energy landscape over the last 30 years and what's going to happen over the next 30 years, or what's likely to happen, what are the scenarios. There's been some drastic changes for 30 years, large economies emerging and the resulting surge in energy demand. And also now we're facing, the increasing energy prices and also some tragic geopolitical turmoil. So this is today's picture. And of course, for the next 30 years, there's the huge climate challenge that we need to face. So today we have very skilled experts to address these issues. And I just want to let you know that besides today's sessions, there's going to be other presentations in the coming weeks. So next week's going to be a presentation on the decarbonization of energy systems. On March 22, another one on energy demand in developed and developing countries. And the last one will be addressing the energy transition and the challenge that it implies for each and every one of us, right? So now let's start today's session. I'm gonna hand the floor over to Marie Rousselot, who is the manager of our energy efficiency and demand department, who's gonna be hosting today's webinar. Hi, Marie.
Hi, Christian. Thank you for your introduction. I'm very delighted to host today our roundtable on the global economy and energy transition. What I will ask today specifically to our speakers is to both provide some historical context on this vast subject and also give us some keys to understanding the future. Today, the presentations will focus on major changes of the energy system and the energy world projections in 2050, on the past trends and expected changes in the dynamics of the world economy, and also on climate policies currently undertaken in the G20 countries, the diagnostic on the needs for reinforcing policy initiatives and expected changes in the dynamics of the world economy. So this insight, they will last about half an hour until 12:30. And after that, we will have a 40-minute roundtable discussion where you and I can ask questions. And for you, please use the Q&A box on the screen from Zoom. Today, we have three speakers. Quentin Bchini, who is project manager in the Global Energy Forecasting Department at Enerdata. He works in particular on future projections of world energy systems. We also welcome Patrick Criqui, who is a senior researcher emeritus at CNRS, the French National Research Center, and the University of Grenoble Alpes. His work focuses on the economic analysis of energy and climate policies from a multi-scale perspective, international, European, national, and local. And finally, welcome to Gerd Leipold, who is Director of Climate Transparency, which is a global partnership that aims to encourage climate action in the G20 countries. So we have around this virtual table people with very different profiles, and this should give us a very interesting debate. We will have about 8 minutes per speaker for their presentation. And after that, I will take questions from the floor. Quentin, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Quentin Bchini, and I will give you a broad presentation of what happens basically globally when it comes to energy demand in the last 30 years, and what can we expect in the next 30 years in that regard. So let's dive in. So first of all, and I don't think this will come as a shock to anyone, global primary energy demand has increased quite significantly since 1990, by 60% actually. And you can see that there are different regional dynamics basically. And what you can see in the chart on the right here is that you have both the increase in primary demand or the evolution of primary demand in OECD members and non-OECD members, used here as a proxy for basically developed economies on the one side and emerging economies on the other side. But you can also see how the energy intensity of the respective economies have evolved. So energy intensity being the ratio between energy consumption and GDP. GDP in this case at the constant power purchasing parity to avoid the account of inflation so what you see here is that in emerging economies, primary energy demand has more than doubled since 1990, while OECD countries' energy consumption has remained relatively stable, and emerging economies being the main reason why global primary energy demand has increased that much since 1990. If you look at, this example of basically breaking down energy consumptions by main drivers, so obviously it's a very simplistic vision, it doesn't tell the full story, but you can consider energy consumption as being the product of population, GDP per capita, so the ratio of GDP per population, and energy consumption on the GDP, which in this case would be an indicator of energy intensity, as I mentioned before. So if you look at it this way, you can see that what is the role of the different drivers, and especially in the different regions. So on the top we have this particular breakdown of the evolution of energy consumption in the OECD countries, being representative of developed economies, and at the bottom of non-OECD countries. So what you can see here is that the main driver here would be economic growth, right? So population obviously has an impact, especially in non-OECD countries, which have seen the population increase a bit more. So it has increased theoretically energy consumption by 50% if you only take into account that the evolution of population. But GDP, the increase of GDP per capita is by far the main driver. And then after that, you have to account for a decrease of energy intensity, which allows to sort of mitigate this increase in energy consumption. Now, energy intensity is not necessarily a proxy for energy efficiency. It can also be reflective of, structural changes, like typically, tertiarization of economy, for example, is an example where part of the activity switches to non as energy intensive activity, basically. But it could be also that, especially in OECD countries, that part of this minus 38% here could be due to energy efficiency measures. Now, looking at considering this and what we've observed historically in that regard, we can now look at what is expected in the next 30 years. So what we have here at the bottom left is, sort of a base case scenario. It's the Enerdata scenario, which is a scenario that we produce at Enerdata. I will say a bit more about this in the next slides. And it gives you, a business as usual or a base case evolution of energy demand. And you have this sort of breakdown that is applied here as well. And we can see that, population will have a relatively minor role in increasing population on its own, right? Will have a relatively minor role in increasing energy consumption by 2050. But then again, the GDP per capita element is the main driver. And by sort of continuing what we've observed in terms of increase or decrease of energy intensity, we'll get to a 40% increase in global energy consumption by 2050. So that's a base case scenario. Right. And yeah, on the right, you can see that this is also applicable, like the increase is also reflected in final energy consumption as well, with emerging economies accounting for 70% of global consumption by 2050. So they will continue to increase their share in the total global energy demand. Now, looking at different perspectives, right? Different sort of potential evolution of energy systems here. So Enebase is the scenario that I presented in the last slide. So Enebase being a base case scenario, right? It's just existing measures, more or less an extrapolation of historic trends when it comes to energy intensity, for example. Now, we have produced also two alternative scenarios, right? The first one being Blue, which is a scenario where we have additional measures that are deemed realistic and specifically that are compatible with nationally determined contributions, or at least the emission targets that have been formulated. So this would be sort of an alternative scenario where that can be considered as a stated policy scenario, to refer to other sources that you probably know. And gives sort of an intermediate evolution of energy demand and other variables. But we also consider the Green scenario, which is a scenario that is compatible with a temperature increase, which will be below 2 degrees Celsius, right? So more of a deep decarbonization pathway. And as you can see, there are huge differences when it comes to, global primary energy demand here by 2050, but also in other indicators related to CO2 emissions. So the share of fossil fuels will drop also significantly, and the CO2 emissions from the energy system will drop significantly as well. And if you look at particularly the evolution of energy intensity of the GDP, so a variable that we've seen in the previous slides, we can see that. So in the Enebase scenario, we are more or less in line. So it's a percentage evolution per year, right, by 2050 on average. So in the Enebase scenario, we are more or less in line with what we've seen historically, with a minus 1.6% decrease per year. Blue is not significantly different. It's a slight improvement, so a little bit more than 2% per year decrease. And Green is definitely a more profound transformation of energy demand, with a almost 4% per year decrease by 2050. So to conclude on what's been said, we've had a significant increase of energy consumption in the last 30 years, which has been mostly driven by economic and demographic growth, right? And mostly economic, as we've seen. And this is not going to change, right? Even if you have a decrease in energy intensity, even if you consider a continuation of the trends in decreasing energy intensity, whether it is for structural reasons or for energy efficiency improvements, you will have a significant increase in energy demand unless we introduce meaningful and important measures to further decouple GDP and energy consumption. So to go from the Enebase case where we had a 40% increase in energy demand to a more of a Green scenario, which is compatible with a 2-degree temperature increase, is going to require a lot of changes. And overall, in any deep decarbonization pathways or 1.5 scenario or net zero emission scenarios, you have to consider all the levers available to decrease emissions. And among those levers is not just decarbonizing the energy supply, but it's also reducing demand through both technical but also behavioral means, right? And as we've seen, but it's just what we've seen earlier with the Green scenario, we would need to at least, to speak in concrete terms, we would need to at least multiply by 2 the decrease of energy intensity compared to the last 30 years to reach an acceptable outcome in terms of temperature increase. So that's all from me. I will leave you back the floor, Marie.
Thank you, Quentin, for these very interesting insights to 2050. I now let the floor to Patrick.
Yes. Can I have the screen?
Yes, you have to ask for sharing the document. So it's going to be.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Quentin, for this presentation. My presentation will go to an analysis of the main changes in the world economy since 1990 and the perspective towards 2050, with an identification of different possible state of the world and the way energy and climate policies may be introduced in these different states of the world. First of all, it is useless to say today that global crises strongly impact the dynamics in the world economy. They impact and introduce major uncertainties. First of all, geopolitics, needless to say, the pandemic crisis, climate change, the problem of aging in the different societies, mainly in the most advanced societies, the question of mineral supply, food security, the uncertainties introduced by technological change. In spite of all these uncertainties, it is interesting to have a look at the drivers, the fundamental drivers that have to be considered and also maybe modeled in order to understand the long-term dynamics in the world economy. And for this, I will base my analysis on a study provided by the CEPI. The CEPI is a think tank by the French government, Centre d'études prospectives et d'information internationale. And since quite a long time now, maybe still more years than Enerdata, the CEPI is producing analysis of the world economy while using an approach based on three-factor production functions for each region of the world. The three factors are population, or the workforce, the capital stock, and the saving capabilities of the different regions, and the energy use in the production process. On top of this, there is, of course, the impact of productivity growth or of technical progress. With this type of approach, the CEPI have projections for the main countries of the world. And it is interesting to note that this allows to have a clear identification of the main changes in the world economy since 1990, today, and towards 2050. As you can see here, in 1990, the top 5 countries in terms of GDP were United States, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and China, for instance, was only the 10th country in terms of economic weight. Today, of course, the picture has drastically changed as China is now second behind the United States, but with a GDP which is nearing the one of the United States. Then comes Japan, Germany, as a 5th country, India, then United Kingdom, France, and the other countries. What is expected for 2050 using the world macroeconomic model of CEPI is a continuation of the major trends, with China that would be the first world economy by 2030, and a GDP that is about 50% more than the one of the United States in 2050. In 2050, the top 5 is China, United States, India, Japan, Germany. France is in a 9th position, And as you can see, Russia has disappeared from the top 10 countries, which is something to be noted in the present conditions. What is the long-term view of the world economy, of the world energy in this horizon 2050 by the CEPI? This study points to the fact that without additional policies and in spite of continuous energy intensity gains, world energy consumption will almost double between today and 2050, which is a little bit more than the base case of Enerdata. This is for the total primary energy. This might explain part of the difference. But in any case, this means that keeping up with the Paris Agreement targets will imply reinforced action for more sufficiency, energy efficiency, and deep decarbonization of energy supply in all regions of the world. If we have a look now on the potential changes, the momentum and the ruptures, what are the perspectives for the world economy? Well, first point, it has been noted that ruptures are needed in the economic and energy climate policies in order to stick to the targets of the Paris Agreement. The future trends in the economy will strongly depend on two dimensions. The first dimension is the one of economic integration. Will we have a continuation of globalization with a hyper-globalization? Or will we have a slowdown in globalization or deglobalization? The second dimension is the question of international governance. Will there be conflict or cooperation? In that way, we can identify four configurations of the world economy. Hyper-globalization and conflict, this would be the law of the jungle. Cooperation and hyper-globalization to some extent is the economist's dream. If we have deglobalization and conflict, this is a vision of fragmentation of the world economy. And finally, if we have some degree of cooperation and deglobalization, we might have a reasoned relocation of the economy. What are the climate policies that can be associated with these states of the world? In the law of the jungle case, we have a scenario of great openness. Climate policies are under the risks of a prisoner's dilemma and climate inaction, and there might be only strong climate action if global energy and technology companies compete for the deployment of low carbon technologies. In the economist stream, this is I don't know if it is the most desirable scenario, but in any case, this is probably a highly theoretical scenario. In any case, in that case, for economic efficiency reasons, the solution might be to use a world carbon tax or an international emission trading system, as is identified by two Nobel Prizes, Bill Nordhaus and Jean Tirole, and by Christian Gollier in France. This is the vision of the economist. In the fragmentation case, we have a low level of openness and adverse economic consequences and probably a lower growth, but more resilience to external shocks, with climate policies largely based on sobriety, efficiency, and local energy sources. In the recent relocation case, we have seen in the COVID crisis the risks of offshoring value chains, and with the Ukrainian crisis, the risk of high energy dependence. So in that case, there might be a need for major companies to develop low carbon technologies appropriate to the conditions of each region of the world. And also low carbon technology mix will depend on the impulse of public policies at regional level. To conclude, please look up. Probably most of you have seen the film Don't Look Up, which means that we can face the challenges or disregard the challenges. This is an encouragement to look up indeed and to face the challenges. Since the end of World War II, the world has probably never been more uncertain than today. The COVID and the Ukrainian crisis are outbursts that implied drastic changes, in energy and climate policies. Climate change is probably a slower burning problem, but its consequences might be still more devastating than the crisis we are going through today. And what is more, we have been aware well in advance. Thus, there is an emergency to find the right combination of economically efficient and socially acceptable solutions for each political space in order to manage the double challenge of climate and energy dependence. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Patrick, for this very interesting presentation on the dynamics of the world economy. And I will now let the floor to Gerd. Climate policy, quo vadis? The floor is yours, Gerd.
Thank you, Marie. After these two presentations, which gave a historical perspective of where we coming from and where the data point to where we are going, but also the political scenarios, I will more focus on where we are now and how we got to there, with a special attention to climate policy and public opinion, public pressure. I've identified 4 drivers. There is, on one hand, the groundbreaking Paris Agreement of 2015. It's groundbreaking because after the failure of the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Summit, there was a smart architecture developed, realizing that top-down treaties would not work. There's a top-down goal and bottom-up activities. And the Paris Agreement has led to an enormous increase in climate policy in nearly all countries of the world. It has also been ratified much faster than nearly every international treaty, and it has a wider ratification than, I believe, any other international treaty. In recent times, we also have a further development that the net zero announcements, countries felt obliged, felt pressured, felt responsible to declare that by mid-century, their economies and their countries would have net zero emissions. That we got so far, and especially in recent times got so far, has a lot to do with the youth movement and other protest movements. They created a public movement, they created support for politics. And what is not often noticed, one should not forget, young people have a disproportional influence on decision makers. Decision makers normally are a bit aloof, but in their own family, they are expressed to a moral and ethical pressure which is hard to resist. And I would credit this movement also that, in fact, the 1.5 degree, which was only an afterthought in the Paris Agreement and put in order to get everyone satisfied, but where the main target goal was 2.0 degree, is in practical terms replaced by 1.5. That's the only goal most countries talk about. Further drivers were obviously science, technology, and the industry. The IPCC, again, like the Paris Agreement, is a groundbreaking new system that it made the bridge between what scientists knew and what governments were willing to consider. And I do not know of any other environmental field or security field where we have this kind of independent analysis, which nevertheless carries endorsement by governments without having the controls of governments. We all know that renewables have become cost competitive, and that has already led to sizable industry investments. And as we know, invested capital tends to defend itself very well and to make sure that it's profitable. And finally, an important driver were extreme weather events. And we have seen an increase in extreme weather events, but equally important, the reporting about it, and especially making the link between weather events and climate change has enormously increased and therefore created a stronger awareness of climate change and the need to act. Now, what challenges do we face? And again, I've identified 4. First of all, the national determined contribution, the so-called NDCs, need to be implemented and improve. Their ambition is too low. They will not be sufficient to reach it. But maybe even bigger is not just to declare what one wants to achieve, but to implement the policies and to make them work. And this is by no means a trivial task, and probably the one where over the next 2-3 years, most attention should go to. We are talking of nothing less, and transition is even a too mild word for what we are looking to. It's a transformation as much as a transition. And one of the big challenges in this transition to a net zero world is how to get credible pathways to mid-century net zero emissions. And one of the most difficult tasks is what would we need to have achieved in 2030? If we only look at emissions, they will not tell us enough whether we are on the right pathway, because we are looking at fundamental changes in infrastructure, and where sometimes policies, the good and the right policies, have no immediate or a slow immediate effect in order for a longer term effect. So too fast gradual reduction until 2030 without the fundamental shift in infrastructure will not lead us to the target. And I think this is one of the debates one needs to have. As we have seen in recent years, Ukraine and Corona as an example, there will always be short-term crises and short-term crises that intervene. And these are not two isolated cases. They are rather will be the rule over the next 30 years, that there will be crises coming. We can't predict them. And this is in light of that we need to have continued attention to climate change. And we should not forget that the present high level of public support is not guaranteed. And with less public support, the commitment by politics, but also of industry, might be less than it is actually needed. So to continue to have the public support and find a way how to steer a clear course of the ship towards net zero, in a very stormy environment where storms and dramatic storms will intervene, is a big challenge. And this has mentioned before as well, achieving sustainability with a growing world population and in particular a predicted strong increase of economic growth is quite a challenge. I think one is no longer a radical to say that present economic models are not sustainable. And what the answer to it is, what a sustainable world looks like, that's probably what we will touch in the following roundtable discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Gerd. Thank you to all of our speakers. I think it's now time to take some questions from the floor. There are several questions already. Some have been answered directly on the chat. There was one question from Jean-Sébastien Brock, who asked if the impacts of a likely increase in the frequency of extreme weather events were taken into account in the scenarios. This was a question for Quentin. Quentin, you answered that no, but I would like to maybe enlarge a bit these questions with the fact that how far for the moment the scenarios can take into account unexpected shocks and crises like pandemics or war, this is actual, or other crises that may occur more frequently in a more unstable world in the future. So how is it taken into account for the moment, and how would it, how can we do that, Quentin?
It's a difficult question to address, to be honest. When you're doing, well, what we call prospective analysis, when you're looking at such a long term, you know, a long horizon and a huge timeline, and you know, there are a lot of uncertainties, and there's already a lot of variables that we try to assess what would be the impact of, you know, their variation, but you're sort of limited in that the amount of sensitivity analysis that you're doing. So so I think it applies generally. You know, there are a lot of assumptions that we have to make. They can vary within a pretty big range, and it's always complicated to deal with that. So I'd rather see that, you know, whenever you're producing such scenarios, it's sort of a contribution to a larger consensus or a larger you know, work overall, which, you know, many institutions are taking part of. When it comes to specifically, you know, these sorts of shocks, and I think the only thing I will say, even though it's not a direct answer to your question, is that when you're looking at deep decarbonization pathways, they're actually often reducing the likelihood of seeing these sorts of events happening, whether it is, you know, reducing our reliance to fossil fuels. This sort of reduces the risk of, you know, geopolitical issues, or, you know, anything that's related to, you know, impacts on climate. Obviously, having a more ambitious scenarios in reducing the emissions will allow to, you know, reduce the risk of having extreme occurrences of, you know, related to climate. So yeah, it's difficult to say. That this is typically not something that we're covering very well. Yeah.
Thank you, Quentin. We have also some questions from the chat that are focusing on the role of sufficiency. So maybe from Angel, Quentin said that in one of his scenarios, technical transformations will influence energy demand. It seems that important societal transformations will also be there. What are your thoughts about that? So there is a question on societal transformations, and also Kapil, who says that energy efficiency for the moment, it's not enough. We see that the decomposition analysis that capita per energy consumption is still the major driver for growth in energy consumption, and that energy sufficiency is not happening fast enough. Rebound effects has also seen. So this is a very large question to all our speakers. How do you see the evolution of energy efficiency and energy sufficiency in the future and in the scenario? Who wants to start? Patrick or Gerd, maybe. Patrick?
Yes, I can give some words on efficiency versus sufficiency. I think that in many cases, these two notions are opposed, and many people say that technical change there might be an opposition between technical solutions and behavioral solutions. I am convinced that the challenge in the energy transformation, as Gerd said, this major transformation can only be succeeded if we have combination of efficiency, sufficiency, and decarbonization. So these three wages for the low carbon transition should be combined. And it is true that sufficiency is an important dimension, but it is also true that the impact is probably not as significant as it should be. In that perspective, what Gerd Leipold mentioned, the fact that the young people might adopt different lifestyles and different behaviors is probably an option for having more sufficiency in the future. But again, it will be easier to be sufficient if we have also the right technologies.
Gerd, what are your thoughts about that?
What we clearly need is wise policy and wise politics, and that needs a long-term view combined with the ability to respond to crisis situation. And at present, for example, we see the possibility that the need to supply energy for Europe could lead to either that we really rethink and make quick decisions of how we change our energy system, or it could say, let's stay with it, let's ramp up coal again, because we have a crisis situation. And we will have these kind of conflicts of interests we will continue to have, and that requires a long-term view of politics. And a long-term view of politics is not just a question of the politicians, it's a question of the modelists who say who we are, it's a question of those who advocate the elements for the future, it's a question of the public that puts pressure on politics and probably behaves different. And it's a question of protest movement to advocate for change. One important probably shift we should consider, it's not just that we continuously emphasize the importance of climate politics, but that we, instead of always look at climate politics in isolation, we look at how other policy fields reflect climate priorities.
Thank you, Gerd. We have a question for Jean-Sébastien, who asks about the major challenges. What about just and fair transition, and especially the conflict between the need of higher energy prices to get investors make the right decisions versus the need to protect vulnerable consumers, ensuring that everyone can meet their energy needs? Gerd, any thought to share on this? And then after Patrick.
I think that questions that the smart solution suggested by the economists is maybe not so smart, but a rather dumb one. Because what the economists do is a theoretical model and ignoring the real political difficulties. If you take the case of South Africa, where 70% dependent on coal, where the best paid jobs in the country are in the coal industry and in the mining industry. If you drive these people out of work, if you increase prices, which would have the desired effect of reducing emissions, but at the same time would increase poverty, then the real problem is not how to establish a price on carbon. The real problem is how to deal with the social change and the consequences of a carbon price. And that's why I think quite often this elegant solution of the economists shows what they often do. They have a hammer and asking for the nail on which they can hit on.
Thank you for this figure. Patrick?
Yes, I will disagree with Gerd, but this is for the pleasure of the discussion, of the debate. I think that indeed applying blindly the tool that is provided by the carbon price would be completely silly indeed. In any case, we have today already very high energy prices. So it is for the moment, the question is not to introduce a carbon price. However, if we can consider that in some time ahead, we will have a somehow stabilized energy systems. This may take some time now, but if we have a stabilized system, there is a way to reconcile the economist solution and the preoccupation for a just transition. And this way is simply to have the right recycling of the products of the carbon tax towards the poor, towards the most disadvantaged part of the population. And indeed, this in that way, if this is possible to introduce this type of scheme, you have the money from the carbon tax and you you use this money to alleviate and to help the poorest in the transition. But surely it will take some time before we can implement this type of solution.
Thank you, Patrick. Again, in the chat, a question to Quentin. Under the Green scenario, in order to reach less than 10 million tons CO2 in 2050, we need to decrease carbon intensity by 7.3% per year on average over 2020-2050. What are respectively the contributions of the renewables, energy efficiency, and energy sobriety in such annual reduction? And I would like to open a bit the question, Quentin. More generally, what makes the difference between two scenarios of contrasted ambitions, respectively a 1.5 degrees or 2.5 degree scenario?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, on the first question, I don't have the exact figures in mind. I'll be happy to share details on the Green scenario. But yeah, that's exactly those are the main drivers essentially. You know, decarbonization through renewables or even nuclear, at least in some countries, and you know, a lot of energy efficiency, which can be a lot of different things, and energy sufficiency, so behavior as a whole playing a key role. As for the differences between these approaches, well, I think it's difficult. I mean, you don't, you know, the scenarios can vary a lot. So it's difficult to give a general answer. But overall, if you're looking at like a 1.5 backcasted approach, right, where you start from the idea of reaching 1.5 temperature increase, and you just, you know, assess what's the right combination of drivers to get there. And on the other hand, having more of existing policies or market driven, or, you know, with a thin layer of policies, these I mean, the latter is actually a scenario that can get you quite far in terms of emission reductions, but the logic is completely different, because I think even if you say we've managed to reduce the emission by, I don't know, 75% in a scenario where it's mostly market driven with a little bit of policies, because of the nature of abatement cost and the types of policies that you often have in these scenarios, which are, you know, like compensation-based policies and that sort of things, by definition, you're just focusing on the low-hanging fruit, right? You're just cherry-picking the cheapest options to decarbonize. So when you say we've reduced emissions by 75% and the objective is 100%, that doesn't mean at all that you've done 75% of the work, right? So doing that will require completely different pathways, will require different solutions. And as Gerd mentioned, often policies for which you don't reap the rewards immediately, right? And that's the key thing. So you end up with a completely different combination of policies and technologies, and sectors which, you know, there are sectors like the power sector, even in a more market-driven approach, you will be able to decarbonize a lot of it, but then you will have sectors in this approach that will be barely affected by this in these scenarios. Whereas in a 1.5 approach, you would need to tackle all sectors basically, and to use all abatement options. So I think that's the key differences between these approaches.
Thank you, Quentin. Patrick, you've presented that some studies suggest that we are in a trend of a regionalization of trade, with a slowing down of the globalization, and with a structuring of the world around blocks of countries, with the USA on the one side, China, and somewhere in the middle, maybe EU. In your opinion, what is the impact of this fragmentation of the world on our current energy systems and exchanges? And to what extent the results of existing energy scenarios, which are mostly based on global trade assumptions, can be questioned?
This is connected with one question we had in the discussion panel, which is in the world of globalization, there will be a continuing development of transport, and how is it compatible with GHG emission reductions? First of all, I think that indeed the structuring of the world economy not in a fully globalized pattern, but in a regionalized way, may indeed slow down the progress in international trade and thus reduce the total volume of trade. And this indeed may have an impact on emission, taking also into account the fact that there may exist solution in order to decarbonize transport, international transport, and particularly ship transport. For instance, the use of ammonia, which is today considered in order to fuel the container ships, is an example of a solution if, of course, the ammonia used is produced through renewable energies. So there are some elements of technological solutions there too. But more in-depth analysis could allow to identify different patterns, different technological patterns for the different regions. There are common challenges for all countries and all regions. And these challenges are largely those of the combination of sufficiency and efficiency that will allow to reduce energy demand and the impact in terms of GHG emissions. But there might also be solutions developed in the different regions of the world in terms of decarbonization of supply, and particularly the mix between renewable energy, the use of hydrogen, the use or not of nuclear energy, the use or not of carbon capture and sequestration may introduce differences in the different regions. I think this is very open today. All the models generally consider the fact that technologies are identical in the different regions and the deployment of the energy supply follows a rule of cost minimization. This is true. There is a logic of cost minimization in the deployment of energy supply patterns, but there will be probably in the future differentiations in the regions of the world. This is a research that, in my view, remains today largely open.
Thank you, Patrick. And Gerd, on the same kind of questions, what do you think, to what extent can a regionalization of the economy be favorable or not for the implementation of ambitious climate policies?
Well, I think like in many areas, we should not isolate climate. And if we only promote policies that have the desired and necessary aim of reducing emissions, then I think we won't be too successful. And it's rather a question, what other benefits can we offer beyond the reduction of emissions? And that regionalization, I think, offers a number of them: a greater stability of people, a greater sense of belonging to it, a chance for diversification and a less development. And I think this sense of that globalization comes with its own risks. We have acutely experienced in the Corona crisis, when suddenly countries were no longer able to even produce the vaccination when we're dependent on a few others. So the enormous efficiencies which are in globalization also come with a risk and a dependency, and therefore I think we will start see a renewal of discussion of stronger regionalization. And I think there again, the benefits beyond helping the climate are important to to look at, because only that will guarantee that there is the broad public support which we will need in the long run.
Thank you. Quentin, from a modeling point of view, what are your thoughts about the ability of the models to take into account those regionalization effects or not? What is lacking? What is now down?
I think it's mostly an issue on not really covering well the interactions between the energy system and the rest of the economy. That's something that's lacking in a lot of energy models, and unfortunately ours is not the exception. So that's usually something that you tackle with, you know, it's coupling energy models with macroeconomic models. But I think, yeah, one of the main issues would be that, you know, there's obviously a limit to the scope of a model, and then that's something to keep in mind, and to you know, to work on those aspects as much as possible. But I think mostly through coupling of different modeling approaches. Yeah.
Thank you. I now have a very general question that I think we all have in mind. Maybe it's to Patrick and Gerd, because it's often felt that climate change is a recent concern. However, the greenhouse effect, which is responsible for climate change, has been known for a long time, in particular with the work of scientists like Arrhenius or Fourier or others. And in the 1980s, even though there was no consensus on the subject from scientists began to put forward the hypothesis that climate change was caused by humans. So why did it take until the 2000s for civil society and the political sphere to take up this issue on a massive scale? Gerd, what do you think?
Well, it depends a bit whether you say it took a very long time. You could also, if you compare it to other areas, say it was quite fast, actually. Yeah, I think, I mean, it is quite normal that societies don't react to everything. Yeah, and I think in 20 years' time we'll probably have a discussion about artificial intelligence, and we'll come to the conclusion that, well, we knew already a lot, and science fiction described us 40 years ago what might come upon us. And it took us a long time to really take it serious. So I think it's quite normal. I would rather say, overall, the world has been faster in reacting to climate change than it has to in other areas. And we have, I mean, again, the Paris Agreement, the fact that we have the UNFCCC is an unprecedented international instrument. The trouble is, climate change proceeds faster than our international negotiation and tools does. But I would not say it has been especially slow.
Patrick, what is your opinion?
In that case, I would agree with Gerd. I think that indeed it would be too long here, but you could draw a parallel between the deployment of the scientific knowledge and scientific work, particularly by IPCC, and the deployment of the international negotiation on climate change. And there has been a very strong interaction between science and international politics. Of course, some countries have been in a backward position in these discussions, and it made things a little bit slower than it was necessary. But globally, the international community has taken the climate problem on board. Then there is a second level of difficulty, which is how to go from the intentions, the roadmaps, the policy, to the transformation, the full transformation of what I would call the socio-technical system. And this is probably the major difficulty, how to go from the science to the policies and then to the real material systems. And this is indeed the difficulty. This takes time. This implies an almost complete change in the energy infrastructure in the different countries. And the big question there is, what are the wedges that will stimulate, accelerate this complete change and complete socio-technical transitions?
So what are they?
What are they? The economists indeed have a solution. As mentioned by Gerd, this is a controversial solution. Another type of solution is changing in the minds and behaviors of all the actors, all the stakeholders in society, whether the citizens, but also the companies and the people in the companies. I think they have quite an important role to play, because they can prepare the part of the solutions for that. But still, there is a problem of what is the incitative element in all that. You can use prices, you can use rules. You probably will have to use both of that. And this is again a problem of the definition of the policy mix to be implemented in order to activate the different wedges. But the inertia in the socio-technical systems is great. And this is our main, as Gerd said, the problem is that the climate change goes faster than the implementation of the solutions.
Thank you. So from the chat, we have a question from Giovanni, who says that fossil fuels can be decarbonized, but the underlying technology is in its early stages of development and is clouded by large uncertainties regarding the speed of implementation and the ultimate feasibility of large-scale application of carbon capture and storage. But that could change in the near future if commercial scale pilot installations under consideration in a number of countries are implemented. So what do you think about those new technologies of carbon capture storage? Maybe from the modeler point of view, Quentin, if you have any of those, either the future development and how it is taken into account in the models, and maybe after Gerd and Patrick, if you have something to add.
Yeah, so I mean, CCS or other, I guess, game changers, technological game changers. I think we already have a relatively optimistic view of their development. So we're not waiting for the first. If we have some data on potential costs, we already try to integrate that into a long-term energy modeling. So we sort of anticipate that these pilots will be successful in that sense. But obviously, if they are, and if we're making progress in a certain directions for certain technologies, then this sort of reduces the range of uncertainty, and obviously helps inform the models. But these solutions we already take into account, and obviously there could be other game changers that will appear from now until 2050, but there's often a lot of uncertainty when it comes to this. So this is why we like to emphasize on the role of behavior. Well, obviously we're relying on technological breakthroughs, but it's also important to not depend too much on these, because there could be some, obviously there are sometimes, like if you look at how the cost of solar energy have evolved recently, there are some positive elements that were not anticipated perhaps, but it's also possible that, when you look at new nuclear reactors, for example, it's quite the opposite. When you were modeling the possibility of having third generation nuclear reactors like 10 years ago, the cost that you would take were, well, much smaller than what we have for the first EPRs in Europe. So yeah, it's why I think we have a good picture, not necessarily a full picture of the technologies that will be available, but yeah.
Thank you, Quentin. Patrick?
Yes, I think that this is a very good remark. The problem is that carbon capture and sequestration or storage is not a new technology. Since I've been working on climate change and new and low carbon technologies, this exists. This is even considered as one of the most cost-effective solutions because with a relatively moderate carbon value or carbon price, you can operate plants with carbon capture and storage. And however, this doesn't develop very quickly. There are experiments, but this is not very quick. So one solution for as far as carbon capture and sequestration is concerned would be to have norms or standards, for instance, for the use of natural gas, to have a power plant that would be allowed only if they use carbon capture and storage. This might be part of the solution. To some extent, this was to a degree introduced in the European taxonomy, because when it has been discussed to introduce a natural gas in the taxonomy, which is today might be considered as a real problem given the situation and the relations with Russia. But when it was considered, there was consideration of introducing constraint on the carbon emitted by the power plant. So implicitly, this was the use of carbon capture and sequestration. There will be indeed a lot of, there is a potential for a lot of game changer, as mentioned by Quentin. This will be probably the issues that will be raised in the second webinar next week, so I will not enter in that. But I will just mention the fact that I do consider that hydrogen, although it has been, it is also known since quite a long time now, but I do consider that hydrogen will probably be part of the solutions. Electrification will certainly be an important dimension of the decarbonization, and having green hydrogen as a complement might also be a game changer in the situation.
Thank you. Gerd, you were approving what Patrick was saying. You are in line with him?
Well, I mean, it is, as Patrick said, it's an old technology. Yeah, it's not a new one. It's not an elegant one. It's an end of pipe technology. And as such, I think the more forward-looking one, and with all sort of technologies that just let the problem, instead of addressing the problem at source, it has also the risk of continuing the mistakes of the past. And I think, therefore, more forward-looking technologies are preferable. But clearly, I think we are in such need of action that we will need both at a whole array of policy tools and also of technologies.
Thank you. We have some more questions from the chat. There are two questions that I will try to group in one. Maybe Gerd, to your opinion, how to make deep decarbonization scenarios credible and desirable for decision makers, how to switch from a view where it is seen as a nice but not realistic to a view where it would become the most desirable scenario. And there is another question in particular for developed countries where energy intensity is already, I mean, good, or what role energy intensity measures can still play for developed countries. So there are two questions in my question, and then after I will ask it for Quentin to have the moderator's view as well. Gerd?
Well, I think the attraction is that we could develop new jobs, we could modernize our industry and increase the quality of life. I think the support to policymakers also comes that at least carefully we can observe some change of behavior of people. So already increase of electric vehicles, even if they are too big and the change of habits is not happening. In how we eat, we have seen quite a bit of changes in the last 20 years. Not in all countries, but I think moving away from meat is clearly reducing meat is clearly a trend. So I think that this mixture of that people willing to take personal consequences now because of Corona, we have all learned that we don't need to fly as much as we used to do, and we can have webinars instead. So I see actually behavior change, which indeed will have a positive effect, but equally important, will make politicians more bold to make in parallel the necessary regulation.
Thank you. So, Quentin, what is your point of view? How make decarbonization scenario desirable for policymakers, and with the specific questions of developed countries where energy efficiency is already at a good level?
That's an excellent question. I think, I mean, as a modeler, I feel a bit limited in that regard, and I think that the main lever, the main area where I see we can play a role is by, you know, increase sort of the robustness and the comprehensiveness also of the studies, to be able to draw more detailed conclusions on you know, what it means, what these scenario means in terms of cost, what they mean in terms of infrastructure, for example, and be able to give us as much detail as we can, to be able to make it, you know, realistic, or at least tangible from the point of view of a decision maker. Because otherwise you're just telling a story, and it's quite difficult to translate that into actual action. So from my point of view, there probably are other things, but from the top of my head, I would say, you know, increase the sort of level of details of these analysis, into you know, to sort of try to bridge the gap between the model and the reality.
Yes, I think that indeed models are very useful, and they are very useful if they are sufficiently detailed. But the most important use of models, in my view, is to produce images of the future energy systems. And this is a way to identify contrasted different possibilities, and then let the politicians and the civil society decide what is the desired future in each society. I think this is very important. This has been, to some extent, an experience that took place in France in 2013 in the so-called National Debate on Energy Transition, when there has been a production of 4 very differentiated, typified energy systems for the future. And then I would say this is up to the combination, the process of democracy and political decision, that can choose the one solution that is considered as the most desirable in each society. So use of models, but to produce alternative views of the future that can then be chosen at a political level in a democratical system.
Thank you, Patrick. The time is almost over. I really thank all of our speakers. I think we had a very interesting debate, very interesting questions. Thank you also to the public for their questions in the chat. Some were not answered, so we'll provide you a written answer after the webinar. Also, the material of this webinar, the presentation, will be made available on our website, Enerdata website. I think we had a very, very interesting exchanges today for this first conference of March. And I really invite you, I hope to see you again on next Tuesday for the second conference. The registration link is on our internet website. Thank you very much, Quentin. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Gerd, and have a good lunch. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.